Hello, welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Han Deng in Beijing. Coming up on today's program, the 2016 APEC meeting sent a strong anti-protectionism message to the world. So, is China about to take over from the US as the champion of free trade? And the world is watching warily as US President-elect Donald Trump forms his cabinet. What do his nominations so far indicate about the path his administration will take? We start with the 2016 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Meeting, which has concluded in the Peruvian capital, Lima. Leaders of the 21 APEC member economies discussed ways to seek better economic growth. They issued a joint statement endorsing free trade and warning of the dangers of protectionism.
The leaders of half the world's economy set aside their differences for a traditional APEC staple, the leaders' group photo. Donning typical Peruvian shawls, they stood shoulder to shoulder. President Xi Jinping stood alongside the host, Peruvian President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. Tough discussions aside, they all agreed on the benefits of free trade.
This has emphasized in a very clear way that free trade, open trade, is fundamental for the world's prosperity.
In a final statement, Kuczynski said protectionism would hurt the 21 Asia-Pacific economies represented here. A clear reference to fears that Obama's successor could change the landscape for trade in the Asia-Pacific region. Speaking at a bilateral meeting between China and the US on Saturday, President pledged to open up China's economy even more and expand cooperation with the US. In his keynote address on Saturday, Xi hinted that Beijing would take the lead in global trade if Washington turns protectionist.
We should firmly pursue the FTAP and provide an institutional mechanism for ensuring an open economy in the Asia-Pacific. We must energize trade and investment to drive growth. We must make free trade arrangements more open and inclusive and safeguard the multilateral trading system.
President Xi Jinping said he would not shut China's door to the outside world, but open it up more. He said innovation and connectivity were new sources of growth, which would boost open, free trade across the Asia-Pacific.
And for more insight into that, we're joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Huo Deming from Peking University. And in Washington, D.C., we have Maricruz McGowan, Vice President of the National Economists Club. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Professor Huo. So I'd like to start with President Xi Jinping's two important speeches at this year's APEC leaders meeting. He sent out clear and strong messages. For example, he said openness is the lifeline of the Asia-Pacific economy. So is he addressing a specific worry that protectionism is coming back?
Well, openness is definitely the heart or the lifeline for China and also for the Asia-Pacific. Now, openness is for the world, especially during Brexit and Trump victory. Right. So I think at this moment, talking about the free trade or the upholding of the free trade to the world in the APEC meeting is a must. China something have to insist because, hey, Obama is going to be away for in a short period of time. In leaders in the United States, it's very hard to predict. But remember that free trade is only part of the globalization. It's not the whole thing. We have to talk about investment. We have to talk about the factor flows, capital plus human labor, so on and so forth. So it's going to be a challenging task for China if China wants to maintain the momentum of globalization, not the other way around. I'm afraid there's a tendency for deglobalization to emerge.
Ms. McGowan, Mr. Trump is a businessman. He's supposed to be a deal maker. Why there are so many people saying that he could embrace trade protectionism?
Well, he's being misunderstood, and I said that the last time. He never said he doesn't want to trade. What he said is all of these years we have been sending bureaucrats to negotiate our trade deals instead of sending people that actually know how to negotiate and actually know how to make very smart trade deals. which doesn't mean I'm not going to trade. He's just going to send the best we have, the best experts, and making sure that these trade deals are going to benefit everybody, including the United States, which has not been happening, in his opinion, in the last decades.
Right, and just to update our viewers, we're joined from New York by Professor Max Wolf from New School University and market strategist for 55 Capital. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. So, talking about Trump's possible policies, and we can see that a TPP has failed, and it's very unlikely for Mr. Trump to reinitiate it. So, does that mean the TPP is long gone, Professor Huo?
No, I think what we're going to see. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I think what we're seeing is a very rapid version of what we saw slowly occurring over many years, which is that now we have the United States essentially promising to at least partially abdicate its duty. Part of what we've historically needed are guarantor nations to push us forward down the track, get international agreements, make sure to have international understandings and cooperation. And you literally do that, and you can only do that on the table. So at some point, it could be better to push a little harder to get a little more of what's in the narrow self-interest. But if everyone does that, global cooperation can be undermined. So the guarantor state, the United States' role, at least in some part, in some regions, I think we're probably ceding. And I think, interestingly, we're seeing other nations, most recently with TTP and APEC summit talks, seeing the Chinese authorities step into that role a little more, saying, we will push this forward down the track, even if the United States is now going to ask for 105% of what's reasonable. We'll figure out a way to keep this going because there's so much at stake and so much value that I think everyone sees, including President-elect Trump, in keeping the international trade structure in place, because it is literally the basis of modern prosperity.
Right, talking about the original, let's not forget about the original idea of the TPP. It excluded China from this partnership. And this is very interesting. I talked to an economist based in Shanghai last week. He said TPP is actually textbook protectionism. Do you agree, Professor Huo?
Well, I don't know. I should say I don't agree. A TPP, as far as I understand, is a sort of a higher standard free trade agreement. Higher standard means there are a lot of restrictions. Well, not restriction, it's just standard. Standard. So in order to participate in such a TPP, in such a agreement, you have to prepare yourself a lot. That is, you have to be very sure about the what they call the property right, the protection of your intellectual property right, and also you have to be sure about very small things. It's a very comprehensive free trade agreement, and it's really good for everybody. But in order to be part of it, you have to be well prepared. Unlike other, even WTO or other free trade agreement, it's very, very loose style. So even if you don't abide by certain rules, you can still get by. But TTP is a very strict on that. So it's not a protectionism, it's a free trade, but it's a high standards high free trade.
But if you just recall, President Barack Obama published an article in the Wall Street Journal this April saying that TPP is targeting China because they cannot let China setting rules for world trade. Why the United States of America is so worried about China getting deeply involved in setting the rules, Mr. McGowan?
Well, you have, well, just
right, Professor.
The instance is intellectual property right protection, right? And obviously, America has the most property right holding in place. So he insisting on the intellectual property right in a way that China cannot catch up with the standard. So in a way, China has been excluded. So there are many other instances like that. So I don't think it's a political agenda just to trying to exclude China, but in fact, it looks like that way. And unfortunately, that's how China is.
And President Obama said that way. What's your take, Ms. McGowan?
Well, my take is really there was nothing going against China. I really don't think so. the TPP had a lot of problems. For example, nobody's talking about the side agreements, which was very important influence of passing, of not passing the TPP. The side agreements are the environmental regulations and the labor regulations, and the TPP was asking for a harmonization of those regulations. So in other words, if the United States had very strict labor and environmental regulations, the other countries also had to have the same stringency, otherwise they will have a comparative advantage, and it will not be fair for the United States that tends to have these regulations at a very high standards. China was not part of the TPP, but now that China has an opportunity, I think a great opportunity, to, especially with Latin America and other countries, Africa, which they have been doing, I think they can start also taking into account those regulations. Why? Because there's this global sentiment, for example, about climate change. You have to take into account that labor, work, child labor, and stuff like that. They have to take into account that before going into any trade agreements. But I still think that China has a unique opportunity at this moment to increase their trade and to get great benefits for them.
Right, talking about China's
time,
opportunities,
help
Professor Wolf,
America.
what do you make of the ChinaLatin Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership?
Yeah, so it looks to me like I see TPP as an effort to push a U.S.-centric model of trade internationally, not so much one country versus another, although unfortunately looks like we're going into a future where there's more sort of nationalism in all these discussions. But I think it was really a push of a model, and that model was not super advantageous historically for some parties, more advantageous for others. I think that, look, the willful abdication and critique of the international order and of globalization coming out of the Trump administration, but quite frankly, many political parties, many parties in various Western countries, really does create a leadership vacuum. And there are very few countries that are in a position to fill it. Most are regional at most. And I think the Chinese have the capability to fill that gap. I think we're seeing at least the experimentation with that leadership mantle in global trade possibly changing hands. I think we've seen little examples of it and regional examples of it in various countries at various moments over the past decade or so, but I think that what was slow and sometimes with counterfactuals looks to be moving much faster and more in a unified direction. But all these things require huge caution. There's much we don't know about what the Trump administration may or may not do. There's some reason to believe they don't know exactly what they're going to do yet either. They're still figuring it out. And so it's a moment of unusual risk and a moment where we have to be unusually humble and unusually aware of how little we know about the most essential challenges facing us next week, next month, next year.
So, Professor, what do you think the United States of America will let China to take this lead? So, take this free trade area of the Asia Pacific, for example. It was first raised in 2006. Now,
Yes.
a decade has passed.
Right.
When it can actually become a reality?
Am I hearing risks? That is the key word. There are a lot of uncertainties, as you mentioned, the free trade agreement for Asia Pacific. That was back 10 years ago. But be honest, there's a little progress. I don't think it's a big impact. Why? Because China, I think, is still a young adult in terms of international game or a rule of games. How to set up the rules and how to participate, how to manage others to join in the process. And to say China is dominating, I think it's too early. So expecting China to play a very big role, important role in the next decade, even if Donald Trump is trying to withdraw himself from the rest of the world, it's still going to take a long time, risks that is involved with China stepping into a lot of international rules need to be changed.
So, what do you think would be the realistic approach for the near future of Asia-Pacific trade?
I think what it's doing now is that just by, especially Asia Pacific, we're looking at so many countries have a different culture, different traditions. So we have to respect that with this respect deep in our mind. And I think for U.S. approach, The U.S. wants to just take the universal rules, and that is very bad for the Asian countries. Remember that China has many problems with neighbors, Japan, Mongolia, or even Vietnam. And so learn to respect each other and learn the trust. And then let's get down to business, and that's the Chinese way. And unlike the United States, they want to sit down and write out all the documents and say, okay, we're going to follow that for the rest of our lives. That's not what Chinese are.
So talking about the Chinese way, Ms. McGowan, we know that President Xi Jinping, prior to his visit to Peru, he visited Ecuador, the first by a Chinese head of state in 36 years. He will visit Chile after his attendance at the APEC leaders meeting. So how do you see the dynamic between China and Latin America so far?
I see that it's very positive. I see, again, there's one thing that I am repeating myself that Latin American countries have to do. They have to diversify their exports to China, going beyond primary goods. I think China wants that too. No, I think there is some kind of saturation at this point just for getting all of these imports from Latin America from primary goods. I think it's going to be very good to have some value added, but I see a very good opportunity for China to start practicing, as I said, not only how to make very smart trade agreements, but also get in tune with what are other countries' regulations, expectations. So when they go to the table, they have to start seriously asking themselves, what can I give to these countries so I will motivate them to sign an agreement with us? And that includes the United States. I'm sure that Mr. Trump is going to continue with their trade agreements, including China, which is one of our most important partners. But as long as the other countries, and China in this case, says, what can I offer the United States, so the United States will be motivated to sign this trade agreement with us.
So, Professor Wolf, what about the factor of geopolitics? Do you think the United States will get alarmed when China is boosting trade and investment in Latin America?
It's possible that we'll get alarmed, but I also think that the same forces behind a potential lessening of our engagement in Asia will also be lessening our engagement in Central and South America, should that road be taken. And I think in terms of some statements, and we'll see what the facts are, and we'll see what the plans are, but the statements in a sort of wild discussion that defined a very long and very unusual presidential cycle here in the U.S. were at least as problematic vis-a-vis our relationships south of our borders as they were our relationships east of the sea. So it's not clear what this means, but it does look like the long process of the United States taking a more considered and slightly smaller role in the world, the path we've been on for the last 8 years, might suddenly become a potentially chest-pounding accusation and a more fierce nationalism in the U.S., something we've seen in many countries, certainly not just the U.S. Were that to happen, my guess is it will accelerate the diminution of U.S. influence, and all over the world, whether or not it's always popular, whether it's resisted, there will be others stepping into the vacuum, and the largest, most vibrant economies in the world would always top that list. Certainly there's no name above China on that list at this moment in the history of the development of the global economy.
Well, Professor Hu, we've talked a lot about free trade, but what about equal trade? Because in the APEC, take APEC member economies, for an example, there are big economies and small economies. Do you think they actually have an equal say in rule setting and in a game of rules?
Theoretically, trade should be equal, should be beneficial to each other,
right.
But in reality, it is not. For big countries trading with smaller countries, there are always bargainings, and especially the bargaining might not be equal. So we have to make sure that it's satisfying people's need. You remember that it's not just the government's talk, it's really people's need. Sometimes you have trade with each other, you look at the trade statistics, it's like, wow, the numbers are good, GDP is growing, but people are suffering. Suffering from the free trade. And that is a de facto circumstance we have to face. So I'm more into, in addition to free trade, I'm more into this factory movement, plus capital, this free movement, globalization, the heart of globalization, whether that will be hindered in the near future.
Thank you very much, dear guest, for your input. And you're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Still to come on World Insight, US President-elect Donald Trump is already causing alarm with his transition team and cabinet picks. So just how far right is the Trump administration likely to lean? Welcome back. Since winning the US presidential election, Donald Trump has been busy gathering people for the country's top posts. So far, he has assigned several top jobs. However, the process is being conducted amid deep division in the country. Trump has to work with those who stood against him during the election campaign. Several top politicians are also ready to pounce on any mistakes Trump makes.
Mitt Romney is the latest to be approached by Trump. The president-elect said last week's meeting with Romney went great, and Vice President-elect Mike Pence confirmed Romney is among those being considered for the post of Secretary of State.
We had a far-reaching conversation with regards to the various theaters in the world where there are interests of the United States of real significance. We discussed those areas and exchanged our views on those topics. Very thorough and in-depth discussion in the time we had.
However, considering his low support rate among politicians, Trump has to face the fact that many on his list of key post candidates have said things about him he may not like. For instance, Romney said during Trump had neither the temperament nor the judgment to be president, accusing him of bullying, misogyny and dishonesty. Trump responded by calling Romney a failed candidate and a rogue artist. Apart from the Secretary of State, Trump has already filled some other posts. Some of his choices are controversial figures. The nominee for Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was rejected as a federal judge in 1986 because he allegedly made racist remarks. Mike Pompeo, the future leader of the CIA, suggested after the 2013 Boston Marathon attack that some Islamic faith leaders might be tacitly encouraging terrorist attacks. Michael Flynn, who is going to be National Security Advisor, has joined concerns over his strident views on Islam. Chief strategist Stephen Bannon is the driving force behind the right-wing Breitbart News website and is openly against feminism. Donald Trump, go away! As well as the unsettled cabinet, another challenge for Trump is closing the deep social division across the country. Public protests against his presidency continue. President Barack Obama has said he may speak out after leaving office if he feels his successor is threatening core American values. And also, Trump has a long way to go before rallying enough support from within his own party.
For more insight into that, we're joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Rick Dunham from Tsinghua University, and in the U.S. state of Iowa, we have Timothy Hago, Professor of Political Science at the University, and in Washington, D.C., we have Howard Schreiter, Managing Partner of Cozen O'Connor Public Strategies. He served in high-level political and executive appointments in the Bush, Clinton and Obama administrations. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. I'd like to start with you, Professor Dunham. So do you see a clear strategy or policy thinking in Trump's making up of his own cabinet?
Well, so far what we've seen is real loyalty. He's gone with Jeff Sessions, who was his closest ally in Congress for Attorney General, one of the core positions. Pick people he's very comfortable with for the security positions, Representative Pompeo and General Flynn. And so I think at this point we can say that they're all hardliners in their own way, but we can't say the whole administration is going to be hardline because we haven't seen the rest of the cabinet. We do know that these people are very strongly against Islam, radical Islam. That's the clear thing we can see, and immigration.
What's your take, Professor Hago?
I think I would generally agree with that. I'm not sure that I would necessarily characterize it so much as a hardliner, that term gets thrown around an awful lot. Certainly there's going to be a move to the right from the Obama administration, but that's not hardly surprising.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
Well, the reality of governing and running a campaign and even the transition are very, very different things. And you know, we're in a situation now where people that have not had the reins of power and have been out there taking various positions are about to have the reins of power, and that changes a lot. They have their ideology, but once they're confronted with the reality of governing, I think we'll see a little bit of a more realistic approach to doing the actual job.
So, Professor Dunham, can you sense some trend in policy making for the Trump administration? For example, Senator Jeff Sessions will become his Attorney General, and he supports limiting legal immigration, arguing it protects American jobs. So will the immigration policy of the U.S. Go to some kind of extremes?
Well, enforcement will change. What you have to realize is that the executive department, executive branch of the U.S. government can't unilaterally set policy, and it has to follow the laws and the appropriations of Congress. President Obama, during his term, used executive power to liberalize a lot in terms of immigration, protecting people who were in the country illegally, but also President Obama deported more people than any recent president. So I think what we will see is we will see more of a crackdown on people in the country illegally, but President Trump alone cannot change immigration policy radically.
But we know that the Republican Party is now in control of both Senate and Congress. So, Mr. Schweitzer, do you think it's much easier for President-elect Trump to get things done?
Well, he'll have the reins of power in the executive branch, and yes, he's got a somewhat friendly Congress, but the fact that they're all of one party isn't the end of the analysis. First of all, the Democrats in the Senate still have tremendous power, and I do not think that is going to change. And second of all, there are many people in Congress that are in the Republican Party that bring different perspectives to an issue like immigration. So the notion that because everyone is of one party, they're just going to rubber stamp, that Congress will just rubber stamp the president-elect's policies once he's in office is not the case. And I think we'll see a lot of debate and discussion about the right places to end up on issues like immigration.
Well, Professor Hagel, let's talk about Mr. Michael Flynn, the new National Security Advisor. He believes the U.S. is losing a global war against Islamist extremism that may last for generations. What does this mean for the U.S. strategy of war on terror?
Well, it probably means, and no surprise here, that we're going to get tougher, at least in the eyes of Flynn and some others, Donald Trump, that think that we haven't been as forceful in terms of prosecuting the war on terrorism. Now, how that's going to actually manifest itself is an open question. Many people think that Flynn is, as was described earlier, a hardliner, or you can use some other term. But my guess is that there are going to be other people that are going to be part of the decision-making process. And Trump may see Flynn as a truth teller in the sense that, look, here there really is a problem, we need to address it. But in terms of how that actually occurs, in terms of the practical aspects to it, that I think that, and this is where even members of Congress may come into play here in terms of appropriations and so forth, that it won't be that it'll be some horrific or drastic change, but it'll certainly be something that will allow, at least on its face, it appear that the United States is more serious about the war on terror than at least Republicans thought that President Obama was.
So, Professor Dunham, will Michael Flynn's, the thinking of Michael Flynn have repercussions on the U.S. domestic policies in the near future? Because in his campaign, Donald Trump said that he endorses extreme vetting for some immigrants. So now we take his campaign words more seriously.
Well, usually the National Security Advisor doesn't have much to do with domestic policy, but in this case I think it is possible because of what you were saying, extreme vetting, because there are some people in the Trump orbit who would want some sort of either registration or knowing of Muslims or potential threats in the U.S. I think concerning what Professor Hagel was saying, I think it'll be interesting to see if there's a balance between these people who are more hawkish and the State Department. I mean, the talk of Mitt Romney as a potential Secretary of State versus a Rudy Giuliani, who has also been very critical of the Obama administration on war on terror. I think it'll be really interesting to see if he picks someone who's more diplomatic or someone who is just as outspoken as General Flynn to be the Secretary of State.
Yeah, talking about balancing, earlier you mentioned that he already picked someone from loyalty, but there's also another part he must appeal to, that is those in the Republican Party who didn't endorse him during his campaign. So do you think he's considering Mitt Romney as a candidate for Secretary of State is appealing to those people?
I think at least the imagery is that he wants to appeal to them. He wants to reach out. We don't know if he is seriously considering him. Sometimes when I watch President-elect Trump, I think that we're still in a reality TV show, and he wants to get people on the set so that he can fire everybody but one of them. So we just don't know. We as analysts were so wrong so often this year that I don't know whether Mitt Romney is being seriously considered or whether it's imagery there. We know that Vice President-elect Pence has said that he's being considered, but again, I will start believing that we're having this outreach when some of these people who are not in the inner orbit are selected, are announced, instead of just being thrown out there as potential candidates.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
Well, I think it depends what post they're in. So state, for example, under recent administrations has been kind of marginalized here in Washington as far as being an important power broker. You know, when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, it was important that she was Secretary of State in terms of running the bureaucracy, but the power center was the White House, not the State Department. When Colin Powell was the Secretary of State under President Bush, the center of power was the White House and not the State Department. So I think in some ways, yes, it's helpful to have a more appealing, superficially appealing kind of traditional establishment figure in that kind of a job, but if the power center remains at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and they're not really included in the process, it can actually be counterproductive.
Well, Professor Hagel, do you think President-elect Donald Trump will reach out to Democrats?
Oh, I think he will. That basically one of his selling points was that he's a deal maker and that he can get along with people. And to a certain extent, we've already seen that occurring as he reached out to people. He complimented Hillary Clinton and saying he's good people and so forth. So he's sort of reaching out. Now, again, that could be superficial. We don't know what's going to happen. And to follow up on some earlier comments, one of the things that really is the case is when, as I heard someone else phrase it, the rhetoric meets the reality. And I think that we're starting to see that, and perhaps Trump is starting to see that in the sense that he said, okay, well, look, this was okay for the campaign and maybe a little bit of the transition, if you want to think of it as a reality show, but you know, at a certain point you're going to have to govern. Now the question is as to what extent Donald Trump is willing to delegate, that he seems to like to do that a fair amount, hire the best people, let them take care of it. But if, as was suggested in some previous administrations, that the center of power was still in the White House, well then it's a little bit more concerning, I suppose, for people that see people like General Flynn that are part of the decision-making process if he's got President Trump's ear.
So, Professor Dunham, what kind of positions do you think Donald Trump will offer to the Democrats? Would they be symbolic or more concrete positions?
No, I would suspect that we'll see several Democrats in the Trump administration. And yes, you're right that across party lines, generally Democrats have hired Republicans to be defense secretary. Republicans have hired Democrats to be transportation secretary or others that are on the periphery of power. But I think right now, some of those secondary positions, President Trump is thinking of people not from a partisan standpoint, but people who would go along with his plans. I wouldn't be surprised if the person he picks for transportation is a Democrat because infrastructure is so important to him, and that's one where Democrats agree with him more than Republicans. But I've heard a wide range from of positions where Democrats are being considered.
And this is also President-elect who advertised 4,000 job vacancies on the internet. So yes. Talking about his policy toward China, do you sense a more conservative or even hostile way?
I don't think we can talk conservative, liberal, left, right. I think he is much more hawkish. Well, hawkish is the wrong word again, but on trade he's more aggressive. And I mean, you have to go by what he said in the campaign, which is that he believes that there should be a 35 or 45% tariff on Chinese goods as a bargain, as at least the first bargaining point. In terms of military, I think a lot of it depends on the relationship with Russia. That if he and Putin and President Xi Jinping work together, it could be good for China. If Donald Trump is less active in the South China Sea than President Obama, it could be good for China. But if President Trump gets upset about trade and somebody's tweet in China makes him mad, then I think that the sparks could fly.
What's your take, Mr. Schweitzer?
We need to see how he's going to do this job generally. You know, this notion of tweeting is obviously something that everybody's talking about. And when you're president of the United States, every single word you say matters. It reverberates around the world. And I don't think we know yet, because I don't think he knows yet, how he's going to do this job. He's going to have to figure it out. I've been through multiple presidential transitions, and in every case, it takes months, once you have the reins of power, to get your footing and figure out how to do the job. You know, he won because he appealed to people in terms of his willingness to challenge institutions, institutions around the world, institutions in the United States, and I think we'll continue to see some of that. He's got to figure out how to do the job.
What's your take, Professor Hagel?
I think one of the things we always have to remember about Donald Trump is that he basically is, again, the deal maker, but also a showman to a certain extent. And part of his negotiating tactic is to talk tough, talk big, and then come back from that position when you actually get to the bargaining table. So even though we need to take seriously what he said on the campaign trail, you also have to take it with a grain of salt in the sense that that's not necessarily where he's going to end up in his final position. Basically, he wants to have fair trade, for example, and so, but is willing to still continue the trade. He doesn't want to shut ourselves off, so he's not an isolationist in that sense. And also in terms of, it's correct that he'll rely or look at very closely anything a president says, but on the other hand, people have to realize that this is Donald Trump, and he has to adjust his behavior, but to a certain extent, perhaps we have to adjust ours too, and take, again, a lot of things that he says with a grain of salt, but we have to wait and see how he ends up being president as opposed to how he was the candidate.
Well, Professor Dunham, you mentioned some aggressive remarks in Trump's campaign toward China. So when he's actually in office, do you think he will continue Barack Obama's pivot to Asia strategy or rebalancing China in the Asia-Pacific?
I think you'll see him. One thing he has talked about is that America shouldn't be everywhere in the world. And I could see him pivoting away from President Obama's pivot to Asia. I think when it comes to China, one of the most important things will be who he names as ambassador to China, as a signal, and
as Secretary of State.
No, I'm saying as ambassador to China. It's being written about in Iowa that Governor Terry Branstad, who knows China very well and has engaged with China, might consider being ambassador to China. If he names someone like that, I think that's sending a signal as to what's the priority. If he names a political friend of his or a business friend, it sends another priority.
But what about trade, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think we have to judge him by what he does. I agree with Professor Hagel that what he did is the first bargaining chip. To be really tough. And the question is the end game. And I think he wants to cut a deal, but he wants to cut a good deal for the U.S. with China. I think harder is going to be Japan and South Korea, where he has said we want more money from them or else we might move out our troops. That's a tougher negotiation because that's geopolitical. With China, it's almost pure economics, and both sides don't want to lose. So there is room for both of them to try to figure out a win-win solution.
Thank you very much, Professor Dunham, Professor Hagel, and Mr. Schweitzer. And that's all for today's program. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Beijing, from me, Panda, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for more insights from across China and around the world.